of the Vanlife Summit. Today, I'm really excited to be talking to Benjamin Woodford, a full-time van lifer here with me. Hey, Ben, thanks for joining.
Hey, Kristen, thanks for having me. I really am stoked to be here, and I love that introduction. That was wonderful. Uh,
Yeah,
so I'm just going to start by telling people just a tiny bit about myself and what I'm doing, and then we're going to jump into some van life stories and see if hopefully people get some takeaways from that.
awesome.
So I have been on the road for 2 years, as you said. I've been kind of all over the country, and something unique about my journey is that I built myself an accessible rig, and I've been traveling alone as a wheelchair user, which is not something that I see very often in van life. And I think a lot of people have different versions of a disability, whether it's, anxiety or physical limitations or old age. And I think a lot of us can maybe relate to some of the things I've been through, even if they don't necessarily have a disability themselves. So I'm going to share a few stories and see what we can come up with. But first, here's my van. Now, this is the van I bought as an old Snap-on tool truck, and I ripped it out and renovated it and kind of built what I think of as my perfect little tiny home. And I travel and enjoy it, and it is very much specific and custom to me, which I think is something about all of our vans, that we just feel that home piece because it's our home, and it's something we can really adjust to make just what we need. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the van today. I'm going to talk more about kind of the journey and what we've been through along the way. And let's start by just a couple little tidbits about van life and what I think the numbers represent. So, spent a bunch of money on the van, but I saved a bunch of money on rent in the 2 years I've been traveling. So I feel like that's about a wash. I've been at about 20,000 miles on the road, which I worked out the math. Turns out that's 1,500 gallons of diesel, and roughly I spent about the same amount of energy as if I was living in a house, give or take. That's using solar, burning diesel, definitely less water than a house user, though. And I feel really good about that. I think a lot of us have kind of that conservation minded feeling like we want to be doing better for the world. And working out the numbers, it turns out it is a little bit better, even if you're traveling pretty heavily. So that's a good one. Now,
Yeah.
let's move on here. I think you had a question for me to start us off.
Yeah, totally. I'm wondering, what prompted you to live the van life? Why did you start this journey?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we all have our own reason. I've heard a lot of similarities between a lot of the van lifers I've talked to, but I think this is one we can all sort of relate to. It all started here. I was living on what looks like a deserted country club, and for a while it was. You guys probably remember that global pandemic thing that happened a while back. Right. Well,
Yeah.
this used to be a bustling academic community that I was living in. And although I loved it and I had a great time there, at some point, everything got shut down and I found myself basically living on a deserted paradise. And while that might not sound that bad, I'll tell you what, I don't know where we were all at during the pandemic, but it got real old being alone. And I saw the writing on the wall when my work became remote and I had the opportunity. I pulled the trigger and I took it. And that was the start, is just realizing I didn't want to live alone no matter where I was at. So I got this old truck and had this grand idea that I was going to set off and enjoy the world and do all this crazy adventuring. But first, I had to build myself my adventure rig. And I ended up just floating around for months and months. So you can see me late at night working after my job was done and my research duties were done. I still had to get this home ready. And it was a lot of work. I think any of us that built a rig or customize our rig or make additions to our rig know that it's like this individual journey of figuring out what you like and how you want it to go and what it's going to look like when it's done, and trying to imagine what your life is going to be like as you're using all these parts day to day. And I gotta say, I ended up with a rig that I feel like is better than any apartment I had, and I own it, and it's mine, and I can take it anywhere, and that's powerful. But I didn't really plan on going out into the world as a solo wheelchair van lifer. It wasn't what I wanted to do. I had a girlfriend, I had a dog, we had a plan. We were going to take off and have this grand adventure, but plans don't always go the way you expect them to, right? We all have an idea of what van life is going to look like. We see the pictures on Instagram and think, yeah, that's going to be so much fun, right? But the reality is, life throws you curveballs and you don't know where you're going to end up. So, although I did not set off to be a solo disabled van lifer, that's what ended up happening. Um, as I was making my build, I ended up ending my relationship, and my sweet dog died a few months into the trip. And it was just not what I planned, but everything I ever wanted and all the same. So,
Yeah. So, was it challenging at first for you to live solo on the road as somebody with a disability? What was that like?
I mean, yeah, and I think we all kind of see the pictures of what it's supposed to look like or what we think it's going to look like, but it was not easy. Now, there's obviously the normal van life problems. We all have breakdowns. This particular case, I was stuck for a week at an RV repair shop just waiting for parts. And, anyone living in a vehicle has to deal with that. Another time, I was sitting on the side of the freeway for 24 hours with, this was a busy freeway with trucks rushing by at 70 miles an hour for so long, it felt like I was living in a nightmare. But, you know, I think honestly, the hardest part is not just dealing with the daily struggles or the things that might come up, because everybody has to deal with that. And that really has nothing to do with a disability. That's just living van life. But for me, I think it was the loneliness. I spent so much time alone over the last 2 years. And it's not like, I've mentioned this to people, and people are like, oh, it's like solitary confinement. That's such a horrible thing to do to a person. I'm like, it's not like that at all, though, because I'm in nature. I'm choosing to be there, and I can leave anytime I want. But even with that, I've had to sit and face myself in ways that I don't think you could ever do at home, because you have your television and you have your internet connectivity and you have all your friends and your kind of restaurants nearby. And living van life has given me this opportunity to really just sit in nature, sit with myself, sit without connectivity, sit with my thoughts and my fears and my loneliness and all of these, things I want to get done that are hard to do alone. And there's nobody around to ask for help. I've gotten lost in the woods. I've gotten stuck in the mud. I've gotten just stuck having to think through like some of the hardest life changes that you could ever imagine happening, between family deaths and breakdowns and just, sheer loneliness. And in a lot of ways, it felt like I just had to kind of burn it all down. Like everything I came from, everything I thought I wanted to be, everything I thought it was going to look like. And it's not a physical burning, but it's like this metaphorical change of who I am and how I see myself in the world. And, the things that I think of as, valid struggles versus just acceptable, expected struggles. And while I would never want anyone to go into solitary confinement, at the same time, I would wish that everybody got a chance to really sit with themselves that way and chose to be able to just kind of strike out and say, you know what? I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, but I know I'm going to be ready for it. And that's something that's really become clear to me in new ways through this journey. And I'm so glad I've had that chance to just, in a way, suffer through it until I realized it wasn't really much suffering at all. It was just another day.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that. And I'm curious with some of the struggles and loneliness you talked about. Why do you keep living van life, or what keeps you pushing forward with the traveling journey?
Yeah, I think, people ask a lot, where is my favorite place? But for me, it's not really a place that makes it special. It's the people there. And a couple of little stories from that is, this is my first caravan group. So it was about 6 months into van life, and I'd still pretty much been alone, other than one big gathering that I really enjoyed and I'll tell you about. But this one, I met this great group, and we all got to travel together and kind of have that, that thing we all imagine is going to happen when we're in our van, where we're going to meet cool friends and go to cool places. And this group has always stood out. We still keep a WhatsApp group, and we kind of send each other pictures and messages to see where we're at. but it gave me that first taste of, there's people out there that I can be around and enjoy and can see each other and understand what each other's struggles and stay in touch. And, I consider myself a bit of an introvert. So being able to find these small groups of people where we can really connect, it makes it all worth it, even though it ends and you move on, or, it changes how it looks. It's just such an encouraging part of the journey. And I want to share one other meeting that I had, and this was kind of a chance meeting that's really blossomed since then. And I think it has reminded me to just stay open to what comes along and the people that show up, because you never know where your friends are going to come from. Now, this is Mark and Marina. Some of you may know them from social media as the Wanderbox, but I met these two at a kind of chance conversation at Descend on Bend, which was my first meeting, my first kind of van life gathering. And we had this conversation, and they told me about this documentary that they were creating. And I'm like, oh, that sounds really cool. Like, I want to be involved if I can. And we ended up sitting down and doing an interview. And this was almost 2 years ago, so it almost feels like a distant memory at this point. But we sat down and did this interview and became friends afterwards. We've stayed in touch. I actually suffered a pretty big loss, death in the family, and Mark was one of the few people that reached out and just sat with me and let me cry on the phone for an hour while I was just so distraught I didn't know what to do. But it turns out this interview I gave them a couple years ago ended up becoming part of their documentary, and we just screened it a couple weeks ago at the Schoolie Palooza event. And I was very surprised to see, minutes and minutes of this talk showing up years later in this really cool van life exposition. But I think the lesson I learned from this, one of them, besides the lessons from the friendship, is just how much saying yes and being willing to just go with whatever comes your way is a big part of what I find is the highlights of my own van life journey. When things come up, I might, even my past life have been, oh, I have an appointment or a meeting or somewhere I have to be. But I've learned so much about just being free to saying yes and seeing where it takes me. And it's been fun. Of course, there's a lot of other people that are too many to mention, and I couldn't possibly share all these stories, but everywhere I go, I've gotten to see family and friends, old, new friends, everyone in between. And it's just been so much fun to have that freedom, and not only have the freedom, but be able to take my accessible rig with me to every place, so that no matter whose house it is or where we're going, I always have that little slice of home that makes it comfortable for me.
Yeah, totally. So, yeah, what do you hope people take away from this talk and what you've said today?
I mean, really, I think it's just that it's always changing. We don't know what's around that next corner. We don't know who we're going to meet next. I don't know where I'm going to be next year or next week, and I often don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight. But I know that I'm going to have a comfortable bed when I get there, and I know that I'm going to have enough power to cook when the sun is up or down, and I know that it's going to work out no matter how hard it gets. Now, there are some exciting new things coming up in my life. I recently met a traveler that I've been starting to travel with, a female, and we were getting along. And I got a new dog. And this dog is like my new buddy on this journey. And so even though van life started out not knowing what was going to happen and not knowing where it was going to take me and feeling very much alone, it's given me so many new friends and so many new adventures and places that I remember and can't wait to go back to. And I even have some traveling companions now. And I think that's what I would love people to know, is that wherever you're at now, it may not be that way in a year, and it can be whatever you want it to be.
Yeah, very, very true. And I love this image. I had a couple more questions for you, if that's okay.
Of course.
Um, yeah, I'm so curious. So you built this rig out yourself, which is just amazing. What are some steps you took to make it wheelchair accessible? Because I do have people write me on my email list, and they're like, "Can I
Yeah,
do this if I'm disabled, if I'm in a wheelchair?" And I don't know what to tell them. So I'm just wondering if you have advice for people out there who want to do this that are in a wheelchair.
absolutely. And thank you for asking. That's why you're here. I think the biggest part is finding the right rig. I looked at so many different rigs, and all of them were different possibilities of it could work. but you have to really think through how you're going to use it, what you're going to use it for. I mean, if you want four-wheel drive, that's a different kind of rig. If you want something with a lift like mine has, that's a different rig. I looked at rigs that had ramps that were like wheelchair accessible shuttle buses. And I realized for me, if something went wrong with that, I had to find a wheelchair accessible place to repair it. And so I ended up going with a commercial vehicle. But I think that a lot of people end up getting buses that have lifts in them already that they take out. A lot of people do all these different things. So there's a lot of options. And the hard part is really understanding what you're going to do with it. So if you want to live in it daily, you got to build it with a different layout than if you want to use it for weekend trips, right? If you want to go through the backwoods, you need something that can stand up to that. An RV would probably crumble if you had a tree the first time, right? So there's just a lot of I think the time shopping for the right vehicle and the time really thinking about the layout is so important because that gives you the possibility to use your space. And the more time you spend with the layout, the more time you spend iterating what you want your rig to be used for, I think the better it'll turn out in the long run.
Yeah, and did you have to, like, modify it and add, like, a ramp? I don't know how any of this works. I'm just curious what modifications you added to the interior that maybe someone could do to their own van once they find one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the big thing was clearances. So, like my hallway where the wheel wells come in is just wide enough that if I didn't give up any space, I could turn around basically at any point in the van, front to back, which is huge, right? You need a lot of time, space to turn the wheelchair around. Similarly, storage, I had to put all my storage things in places where I could reach them and make sure, like for instance, I have drawers that have a low cut on the side of the drawer. So even though the drawer is up high, I can reach over and grab things out of it, even though it's higher than my eye level. I've got, a countertop with slide out cutting boards so that I can work at the countertop without having to be under it completely. I can roll under my sink. I can roll under my stove. The lift that's on here is actually a commercial lift. Now, I'm going to say this, even though I'm probably outing myself a little here, it's actually illegal to use a commercial lift as a wheelchair lift. So if anyone decides to go that route, don't tell people that's your plan because they may not want to service your vehicle, but that's a whole different piece. But I think like I know I'm like, am I supposed to say this? But this is for the good of the community. So there it
Mhm.
is. And really, yeah, it comes down to just making sure you're knowing what you're going to do with it. If you want a back lift or a side lift or a ramp, it comes down to, knowing that that's going to work for when you take it out different places or where you're going to end up.
Very cool, and where have you gone with the rig so far, like, around the country? What's been your route?
I just did a big loop from California to New England, down to Florida, and back, almost back to California now. And before that, I did a nice loop up. My kind of first big trip was up to Canada and back. And I've floated around a lot around Arizona. Like the last 2 winters, I've been in Arizona just because it's like nomad heaven out here. Everybody's so friendly and kind of all traveling and doing their own thing. But I don't know where I'm going next. I think that's the most exciting part for me. Every time I have a new trip planned or I'm planning on relocating, it's like that morning I get up and I start up the truck and I'm like, where am I going to be? Where am I going to be? That's the exciting part for me is just finding out.
It is exciting, and I like what you said about how this is kind of your personal, accessible home instead of having to it's probably difficult to go find accommodations or places you can go. I mean, I'm not sure, but it seems like it's easier to have your own rig that you know so well.
Really is. Even like back home when I was still just starting to travel and find new places to go, I just go park in front of a friend's house for a few days. And even though I could get in their house, it's like I have my own space and my own stuff. And it really does make a difference because most people's houses aren't accessible. A lot of bathrooms and a lot of different kind of daily things that other people take for granted. I mean, for instance, like truck stop showers. A lot of times I go into a truck stop shower and I'm like, hey, can I use their shower? And they're like, yeah, but we don't have any of the accessible things you need to do it. I'm like, that's okay. I'll just go to my van, whatever.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really opened up so much, like the travel, the meeting people, and it just sounds like such a wonderful lifestyle. Do you know how long you're gonna do it for?
You know, I started out saying, okay, if I spend 50 grand on the van and I save 2 years of rent, that's 50 grand. I'm even. I didn't cost me anything. Now I'm there. And honestly, I can't think of how I could stop doing this at this point. Although there's a big change, and I'm going to give a plug here because after traveling for 2 years and spending a lot of time kind of, floating around, I'm thinking about joining the Kift community. I don't know if you've heard of Kift, but
Yes, I have. I wanna join too, actually.
yay, well, maybe I'll see you there. But,
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that's gonna be my next chapter. I'm just finishing up grad school, just kind of, turning in my dissertation and finishing up a PhD, and now I'm like, "Okay, next chapter of life," and I think that's gonna be starting a company, and I need a little bit of time and energy and, internet to be able to do that. So I'm gonna settle in at Kift for a while and keep traveling, but slow down a little and just enjoy my van and some company and community.
Cool, and for people who don't know what Kift is, just tell them real
Yeah.
quick what that is.
Yeah, yeah. So Kift is kind of a nomad friendly or nomad centric, I would say, geo-dispersed community. So it's the idea that there's community with lots of different houses across kind of the West Coast for now, and they're expanding. And I think it's a really cool, for me, way to kind of bridge the gap between needing a little bit of stability and also being able to stay in my van and have those travels that I now crave and don't think I can give up so easily. So glad I got to plug Kift because anyone who's interested. And they also do sustainable food and community meals and vegan lifestyle and things like that, which all very much kind of fit into my own style. So
Totally. It sounds amazing, and I'm looking forward to following your journeys, so I can see, like, how that is, and I'm sure a lot of people will be curious as well. It's a great hybrid option, I think. So,
absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time and for
yeah,
doing this meeting with me. And thank you to the Van Life Summit community for joining us today. And really looking forward to hearing from anyone that has questions or follow-ups. I'll be here and you can find me on the socials.
very cool. Thank you so much, Ben, for joining. It was really fun to hear your story and very inspiring. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen.